Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into a huge story, 50,000 years of European history. It's an incredible tale of constant reinvention, of empires rising and falling, and honestly of ideas that shape not just a continent, but our entire modern world. So let's get into how this amazing story unfolded.
Okay, so where do you even start with something this big? Well, our story kicks off about 50,000 years ago, with the first modern humans stepping onto a continent pretty much shaped by ice. From there, we're going to watch as they build these massive empires like Rome, get reborn through the Renaissance, are absolutely shattered by world wars, and then try to build a kind of union that's never been seen before. These are the big turning points that really define Europe.
All right, Section 1, Ancient Foundations. So how in the world do you forge a continental identity from, well, basically scratch? We've got to go way back, to a time before written history, when the very first seeds of what we call civilization were being planted in European soil.
You know, for thousands and thousands of years, human life was all about movement. But then, around 9,000 years ago, this one idea, brought over from the Middle East, changed the entire game: agriculture. Suddenly, you didn't have to follow your food, you could actually grow it. That single shift meant people could finally put down roots, build villages, and organize themselves in totally new, complex ways. It's the reason we get these incredible feats of engineering, like Stonehenge, even being possible.
And once you have stable societies, you get the luxury of big ideas. Think of it like this. The Greeks gave Europe its political and philosophical software. Concepts like democracy and, just thinking rationally about the world. Then the Romans came along and provided the hardware. These guys were master engineers and administrators, building this huge network of roads, aqueducts, and laws that basically stitched a huge chunk of the continent together for the very first time. The foundations they laid, we can still see them today.
Section 2, Faith and Rebirth. But here's the thing about empires, they don't last forever. When Rome fell in the 5th century, it left this massive power vacuum. This new era was going to be defined by a lot of chaos, but also by the rise of a brand new, unifying force, and eventually, a pretty spectacular comeback.
I mean, just try to imagine the central government of an entire continent just disappearing. That's pretty much what happened. The whole Roman system just collapsed, and in its place, you get this patchwork of competing tribal kingdoms. We often call this the Dark Ages, not because people were dumb, but because that old unifying light of Roman order was gone, leading to centuries of fragmentation.
So, out of this chaos, a new system pops up to create some order: feudalism. It was a really rigid social pyramid. You had the peasants at the bottom doing the work, the knights in the middle providing protection, and the clergy at the top. But more than anything, the Christian church became the glue holding Europe together. Inside its monasteries, the knowledge of the ancient world was kept safe, and it gave people a shared identity across a very divided continent.
But this whole medieval world, it turned out to be incredibly fragile. The 14th century was just one catastrophe after another. There was constant war, massive famine, and then the Black Death, a plague that wiped out nearly 1 out of every 3 people. It must have felt like civilization itself was right on the brink of collapse.
So after a century of just unimaginable loss, you have to ask yourself, how could Europe possibly bounce back from that? What on earth could pull the continent out of that darkness and spark a total rebirth?
Well, the answer started in Italy. The city-states there, which had gotten rich from trade, started to rediscover all the amazing art and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. This sparked the Renaissance, a literal rebirth of learning. You get thinkers and artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo who start to see the world in a totally new light. And thanks to Gutenberg's new printing press, these revolutionary ideas could suddenly spread like wildfire, a real game changer.
Section 3, Revolution and Industry. Now, the Renaissance didn't just change art, it changed how people thought about everything. This new spirit of asking questions would set off this chain reaction of revolutions, scientific, political, and industrial, that would completely remake the world.
You can almost see it as a series of dominoes falling. First up, the scientific revolution. Guys like Copernicus and Newton proved the universe runs on laws we can understand, not just on divine will. That inspired the Enlightenment, where philosophers took that same logic and applied it to society, asking, hey, if the universe isn't centered on us, why should government be centered on one all-powerful king? And those questions, they lit the fuse for the American and French revolutions, which demanded liberty and rights for everyone.
So while philosophers were debating rights, this massive technological revolution was physically changing the continent. Steam, iron, and coal turned Europe from a farming society into an industrial beast. This created incredible new wealth and this comfortable new middle class. But, and this is a big but, it came at a price. Millions of people crowded into polluted cities to work in dangerous factories. This created a huge, poor working class and basically set the stage for a century of social conflict. Section 4. A century of war. Okay, so this new world, it's industrial, it's nationalistic, and you've got empires competing for resources all over the globe. It was basically a tinderbox. The 20th century is when that tinderbox finally ignited, plunging Europe into the most destructive period in all of human history.
By 1914, Europe was an absolute powder keg. The big powers had split themselves into two massive, heavily armed military alliances. You had the Triple Entente on one side, the Triple Alliance on the other. It was this tangled web of treaties that meant just one little spark could set the whole continent on fire.
World War I was nothing like the wars that came before it. This was war on an industrial scale. I mean, you have new weapons like the machine gun and poison gas, but they're being used with old tactics. The result was a level of slaughter that's just hard to even wrap your head around. It wiped out an entire generation of young men.
You know, they actually called it the war to end all wars. But the tragic irony is that it did the exact opposite. It did shatter four empires, sure, but the harsh peace deal they forced on Germany, combined with the Great Depression, created the perfect storm for radical extremism to really take root.
And that extremism led straight to World War II. The rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany plunged the continent right back into total war. This conflict brought even more devastation, and at its very heart was the unbelievable horror of the Holocaust. By 1945, Europe was broken, physically and morally, and its fate was now in the hands of two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union.
Section 5. The Unfinished Union. So, crawling out from the rubble of 1945, Europe's leaders had this huge choice to make. Do they risk repeating the same old bloody cycles of nationalism, or could they build something totally new, a future based not on division but on working together?
Well, the immediate answer was another kind of division. Winston Churchill famously said an iron curtain had come down across the continent. So in the West, you had the capitalist democracies in NATO, led by the US. In the East, you're the communist states of the Warsaw Pact, all controlled by the Soviet Union. For more than 40 years, cities like Berlin were the tense front line in this global ideological war.
Then, in 1989, something that seemed impossible happened, and it happened incredibly fast. In this wave of mostly peaceful revolutions, the people of the Eastern Bloc just rose up. It all led to the most powerful symbol you can imagine, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It really felt like a moment of pure, unfiltered hope. That long, cold division was finally over.
But history never really ends, does it? All that optimism from the 90s has been seriously tested by one crisis after another in the 21st century. We had the 2008 financial crash that strained economies, the refugee crisis in 2015 that tested social bonds, and then Brexit in 2016, which fractured the Union. And more recently, the rise of populist movements and the return of a massive war with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It all just shows that this European project is still facing enormous challenges.
Which brings us to right now. After 50,000 years, that fundamental European story, that constant push and pull between breaking apart and coming together, it's still being written. The challenges today are huge, and what Europe's next chapter will look like, well, that's still a very open question.